Alaupa. Alaupa. It's pretty good. Yeah, it does really look beautiful. How are we doing, Patrick? Okay. So, I've been thinking about what to say to you, and I'm somebody who tries to ascribe as much as possible to Abdu'l-Baha's admonition when he asked Howard Colby Ives, you know, how can you prepare sermons in advance? How can you prepare something to say before you've looked into the eyes of the people that you're going to address and see what they need to hear? I'm not sure if I've ascribed to that because I'm not very good at preparing things, or whether I really think it's true. But in thinking about what I might share with you, I was thinking about some of the addresses from Abdu'l-Baha, and there was a quotation or something that he shared with the Friends in New York, which is very close to here, about 100 years ago. He said, "Do you appreciate the day in which you live?" Right? And there's lots of questions in the faith that seem kind of rhetorical, right? The Hidden Words is always asking us all these questions, right? How dost thou busy thyself with another? Right? Why dost thou bring thyself down to poverty? Right? There's all these questions that it asks us. Sometimes they seem a little bit rhetorical. They're poetic, they're beautiful, we know that they're inspiriting us, and at the same time we don't always wonder about the answer. Right? Do you appreciate the day in which you live? Is what Abdu'l-Baha asked us. Do you think you do? I mean, do I think I do? I'm not going to project anything on all of you, but I think it's very difficult to appreciate the gravity of what happened when Baha'u'llah came. Abdu'l-Baha says, do you appreciate the day in which you live? This is the century of the blessed perfection. This is the cycle of the light of his beauty. This is the consummate day of all the prophets. The consummate day of all the prophets. I was asked momentarily, and I think it's a good idea, that we say something briefly about Ruhi. Katrinka mentioned it. And Ruhi simply means spiritual, right? And it's about grassroots transformative processes that are happening in communities everywhere on the globe. Right? It's about taking something from the creative Word of God and changing yourself, right? Actually transforming your soul so that you can become a servant of humanity. And the Baha'is are engaged in this like a project everywhere that there are people, which is pretty much everywhere. I wanted to say a couple words. Counselor Murphy reached out to some of the friends that were not Baha'i among us, and I think that's a good idea. Sometimes we give you a wrong impression, and that wrong impression is that we might not seem overly interested that you join the ranks of the followers of Baha'u'llah. We indeed are. We think it's a pretty good idea. But you can't do it without free inquiry. You can't do it without fair-mindedness, right? You can't do it without curiosity, without turning your reason, your God-given reason, to the claim, the life, and the teachings of Baha'u'llah, and measuring whether they make sense for the world and the condition that it's in. Most of the people in this room feel that they do. They actually feel that the state of humankind is at stake. Right? There's certain problems that humankind can't overcome without establishing their unity, and they cannot do that without a single point of orientation. In the way that the sun provides an orientation point in this contingent world, and everybody turns to it, right? Everybody knows where the sun dawns. The Baha'is believe that these manifestations of God, Baha'u'llah for our age, the glory of God, represents the spiritual point of orientation for all humankind. And as soon as we awaken to that reality, right, then we'll all find ourselves shoulder to shoulder, looking at the same point of light. And mankind will be one. We think it's urgent. And I urge you to turn to the people that you came with and make sure that they don't get away with not telling you what's going on at the core of the faith. Don't let them convince you that it's an ongoing rock concert with lots of talented, wonderful people that smile a lot. In fact, the crucial thing in your life is at stake. This applies pretty much equally, in my opinion, to the Baha'is. Right? Sometimes we sort of create a false dichotomy that the Baha'is have recognized Baha'u'llah, and so somehow they're in, and then the non-Baha'is are kind of awakening to this reality that there was another messenger of God. right after Jesus or Muhammad, right? But in fact, recognition is at stake every day. Baha'u'llah begins the most holy book saying the first duty prescribed by God for his servants is the recognition of him who is the dayspring of his revelation and the fountain of his laws, right? The fountain of his laws, the dayspring of his revelation. This is the first duty in the human being's life, right? But then in this first paragraph from the Aqdas, I'm sure you've memorized it in one of the Ruhi books perhaps or elsewhere, and that it says essentially that it comes as, it follows like the night, the day, which Baha'u'llah says elsewhere, that if you recognize Baha'u'llah, you'll do what he says, right? These twin duties are inseparable. Neither is acceptable without the other, right? As if it's the most logical conclusion that recognizing the source of your creation, recognizing that there's an owner's manual for your very soul, right? And that God out of love has graced you with it, gifted you with it, then we ought to pay attention to it, right? And actually do what it says, knowing that God has our best interests at heart. And yet that's somewhat of a divide. And so we have to continually ask ourselves this question: have we recognized Baha'u'llah? Right? What does Baha'u'llah's revelation really mean? Right? Because Shoghi Effendi says, the guardian of the Baha'i cause, the great-grandson of Baha'u'llah, said that if we truly understood who Baha'u'llah was and who we were, because we bear the name of Baha'is, we would fall to the ground, dumbstruck at the glory of one another, right? Just for bearing this name of Baha. Baha is an Arabic word for glory, right? The followers of the light, the followers of the effulgence of God, the bearers of the name of God in this day. And as the community of the greatest name, as Abdul Baha entitled us, it's something to be really proud of, but also to continually kind of recourse and evaluate whether we're growing in that. Evaluate whether we're growing in our recognition and understanding of who Baha'u'llah was. Friends, when they asked me to give a title for what I thought I might say, well, I didn't have one. And I recoursed to the fire tablet, which I think is so potent, is so special, is something that you should share with everybody you know. And there's some lines in this prayer, or this tablet, that Baha'u'llah revealed. And one of them says, "Abasement hath reached its lowest depth. Where are the emblems of thy glory, O glory of the worlds?" Where are the emblems of thy glory, O glory of the worlds? Now, there were a few things that I was thinking about, right? When I was thinking about this idea of abasement. Abasement hath reached its lowest depth. There's a friend of mine who's been coming to firesides. And his name is Chris. And some of the people here know him. And he's been coming to firesides, and one night he stayed really late. And he's a Christian man, really pious, really loving soul. And he's interested in the faith. He's recently read Baha'u'llah's Kitab-i-Iqan, some other books about the faith. He's met with several of the Baha'is. He's written some papers on it, right? And he asked me a question, and the question made me very sad. Right? The question was this. He said, well, I get a lot of things about the faith. I think the claim was profound, and I take it seriously. There's one thing I don't understand. If Baha'u'llah is who he says he is, how can the Baha'is not make a bigger deal out of it? I mean, if Baha'u'llah is the return of Christ, then what are you guys doing? Where are the emblems of thy glory, O glory of the worlds? There's another friend of mine, and he is a Baha'i. He declared his faith a couple years ago. And last year he was at this conference. I don't think he's here this year. But he's a lovely, lovely soul, and I'm sure many of you know him. He's also really rampantly interested in political culture and progressive politics. And I think one of his frustrations with the faith is that, he has a desire to do something to change the world today. And he sees people endorsing candidates like Barack Obama or whoever they endorse, and he sees them out in the streets. He sees them consecrating their fortunes and their time, approaching people they don't know, telling them that a better day is at hand and here is a way. Proud to be part of a team that's marching forward. right? He sees this opening vista for humanity. If one of these politicians gets the bid to be the candidate in such and such a primary that might win president in, America, which is not the world, right? It's comparatively so minor compared to the revelation of Baha'u'llah that it's almost not worth speaking of. But I bring it up because we're all aware of the enthusiasm and the passion with which people back these presidential candidates. Right? And one of his frustrations with the faith, and I think many other people would be, is that if you're already consecrating your life to a vision of the world that is better, right? If you're giving up your time and your reputation and everything else to go knock on doors, and then the Baha'is supposedly know about the medicine that's a salve for all the ills afflicting humanity, and they're going to stay home. Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, the youth will proclaim the message of Baha'u'llah when they're transformed by it. Like, teaching the faith is the easiest thing to do when one has love for Baha'u'llah and love for the writings, right? I mean, people don't believe in all the laws and want to not drink and not engage in premarital sex and want to follow all of these laws, so then they decide to become Baha'is because the Baha'i faith fits what they already do. Like, they gain strength to actually follow those laws because they recognize Baha'u'llah. Everything flows from that, right? And this idea that the first duty prescribed by God for his servants is the recognition of him who is the dayspring of his revelation really centers the faith and centers the most holy book, right? And, I guess what I was saying to the friends and some of the youth yesterday is that this recognition is not a binary, at least, or if it is, it's not one that we sort of realize, and by being born into a Baha'i family or signing one's declaration card, one has not attained. It's like climbing the lowest of the foothills and then realizing that there's so many other peaks around you. There's so much of the journey left to make. So I think recognition of Baha'u'llah, it's nice to call oneself a Baha'i, but we have to figure out what that means and then learn how to be a Baha'i. Right? Abdul Baha lays down what it means to be a Baha'i, essentially to live a martyrdom. It's a lot like the Tablet of Ahmad, which is, that line in the Tablet of Ahmad when one who recites these verses, will receive the reward of 100 martyrs and a service in both worlds. And, a lot of the Baha'is might, clearly this is not a suggestion that sitting in one's closet reciting the Tablet of Ahmad and you achieve some kind of great martyrdom and these rewards in all the worlds of God. I mean, the Tablet of Ahmad is a call to service, is a call to action. Right? Ahmad wants to come into the presence of Baha'u'llah and is actually held back from coming to Baha'u'llah and sent back into Persia and, through Syria to teach the cause. And, if one can internalize that message and rise to that call of service, live that kind of martyrdom or sacrifice, then one has a chance to, receive the rewards or whatever that are implied in that tablet. So I think it's the same kind of thing, like, what is it really to recognize Baha'u'llah? And, obviously it can't be bestowed upon you, and it's not a constant.
I remember one thing that Becky said that I liked a lot. She said it last year when the friends were talking about race unity. And she said, in the line of what she was saying this morning, she said, race unity for the Baha'is, it's not about having picnics, right? It's about raising up tutors in those communities. It's about helping them to own the faith, helping people of different races to own the faith, to own the source of the medicine that alone can heal the ills that they're afflicted with. I say that because, this idea of whether it's, extreme racism and rape and everything else that goes on in our world, we have something to do about it, right? Abasement hath reached its lowest depth. Now, you know that when Baha'u'llah wrote this tablet, right, he's in Akka, it's 1871, and he's talking about several topical things when he writes the fire tablet, right? This is to Ali Akbar, Ida Haji, and at the time, the faith is infested with covenant breakers, right? People in the Holy Family, people conspiring against the faith, people corrupting the writings, right? Turning away and creating faction and division. And this was so hurtful to Baha'u'llah when people would break the covenant. You know that for Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi too, the greatest pain for them always was when a believer turned away from the faith or broke the covenant, didn't follow the laws of Baha'u'llah. Now, it's a topical reference, the fire tablet. But you know also that Baha'u'llah, when he talks about the creative word, he says that every word that Baha'u'llah reveals, every word that God reveals through these manifestations has infinite meaning. At one point, Baha'u'llah, in a tablet, I can't remember which one, is saying that, he's discoursing on the concept of the sun. And he says there's so many meanings in the word the sun that if I had 10 secretaries and I dictated meanings for the next 2 years, I couldn't exhaust them all. Right? So in light of that, when we think about abasement hath reached its lowest depth, all of these covenant breakers around Baha'u'llah, right, starting to stir up trouble, where are the emblems of thy glory, O glory of the worlds? It applies then, but it applies now every bit as much. And I think some of these examples, this want of example in the Baha'i community, which has even Baha'i friends turning to politics occasionally, right? Which has people wonder if they can really embrace the faith when the Baha'is themselves make so little out of it, and which has us in a world still infested by all kinds of crime and horror. Keep this, you know, highly resonant, this tablet, and I'm sure you know that.
What I was mentioning was just that when we look back at that moment, you know, at those moments of the covenant breakers around Baha'u'llah stirring up such trouble and causing such heartache for the manifestation of God, you know, that he would look around and say, where are the emblems of thy glory, O glory of the worlds? Right? Where is the lion of the forest of thy might? Where is the sun of the heaven of thy grace? Right? Where are the signs of thine avenging wrath, O mover of the worlds? Where is the downpour of the clouds of thy bounty? Right? Where are these things when the world is in such need, when the faith of God is actually in such need? And, you know, he could turn to the horizon and see a lot of faithlessness, right? He asks later, where are the emblems of thy faithfulness? But he could also see people like, you know, Muhammad Rizal. He could see some of these people who clearly gave everything for the cause of God, thousands of them who rose up and died for the cause. And today, you know, those things translate to our time every bit as much, right? There's a sort of timelessness that I spoke about the faith, and, you know, a way that just like the Tablet of Ahmad applies to all of us as well as to the recipient. The fire tablet and these others speak to now as much as they spoke to that day. And Baha'u'llah still seems to be asking through those tablets, where are these champions? Rather, should I weep at the fewness of thy champions? And the hard thing is that, you know, I mentioned to the youth the other day that, you know, Baha'u'llah says, O son of dust, you know, everything, I'm paraphrasing his words here, but everything in the creation I've made for you, except the human heart, right? That's what I want. Like, I need your heart. And that is a binary, right? That is something where he's either got it or he's not. And, you know, living sacrifice, living martyrdom is a, you know, it's not an iffy kind of gray area proposition. It's people who are willing to give themselves over to the cause. And so the Muhammad Rizas of today, the Haydar Alis of today really need to rise up. And whenever they have, thousands of people have become changed. Abdu'l-Baha says one holy soul is worth 1,000 other souls. Right? You can imagine Christ saying, let the dead bury their dead. Right? Because he knows that the whole world is in the faith of those few believers. Right? Those are who are going to plant a seed for the rest of the world, who are going to pass the teachings from mouth to mouth and recreate civilization. And the rest of the people, well, they're dead people burying their dead. And that's what the faith needs. It doesn't need 10 million Baha'is who are all kind of lukewarm about the thing. We'd be better off with 10 people absolutely on fire. Right? Same thing in the core activities and this sort of thing. We don't need 100 people trained in a cluster who can give a children's class and 3 people doing it. It'd be better to have 5 people trained and 5 people doing it.
You know, at this time for Baha'u'llah, and again, I turn your attention to the tablet. At this time for Baha'u'llah, there was almost a feeling that nobody would be loyal. Right? You remember that Christ, when he's in Gethsemane, And Peter and John and James won't stay awake with him, right, when he goes up on the mountain to pray. When Judas turns away. And soon after the death of Christ, when even Peter denies him 3 times, there's this feeling that, the religion of God would not establish itself because the people wouldn't do it, not because Christ wouldn't. And Christ gets to a point where he literally says, "Take this cup away from me, God. I don't want to taste the poison." And in our faith, we had the exile of the worlds, the wronged one of the worlds, Baha'u'llah himself, in exile, poisoned, suffered to chains and torture, right, stripped of every earthly possession, watching his son die, and then the friends turn away from him. And friends, now we have to make a decision because those people are us. There's a historical continuum, there's a oneness in history in the faith. Essentially, those followers of Baha'u'llah are us, and are we going to turn away or not? We're going to be the emblems of glory or not. That is a binary, right? There's a lot of false dichotomies, but I don't think that's one. I think we have to decide. As far as this emblems of glory, I just want to share a couple stories from that time about some of these people. Actually, I don't know how we're doing, but I'll share one. You've heard a lot of the heroic stories of the faith. You probably know a lot of them. You may know a lot better than I do. You know about Badi and Ruhullah and Varga and Haji Akhund and all these wonderful people that grace the pages of the history of our faith. Right? One of these men was named Mullah Muhammad Rizal. You guys know about this guy? Muhammad Rizal was a very special man. He was pious. He was learned. Right? He knew countless traditions in Islam. He was well respected. And when he found out about the faith, he aspired to teach it. He aspired to share it. He took Baha'u'llah face value when he said the faith was not created for you to sit upon, but it was created to share from mouth to mouth. I'm paraphrasing his words. Muhammad Rizal shared it everywhere he could, right? Everywhere he could. And he would literally be taken up in the streets, and he would be whipped and beaten for it. Right? And he knew that in advance. He knew that I'm going to go into this town and I'm going to share the faith, and then they're going to beat me. Right? That was the script. And they would tell the story about Muhammad Rizal that he would be one when they would whip him with the bastonado. Right? They would tie him around the feet, and they would take a cane to his feet in the streets. And he would put a sort of his cloak up in front of his face and just calmly resign himself. Right? He'd make no noise. He wouldn't cry out. And when he would remove his cloak at the end, he would be smiling. Often looking at them, sometimes eyes closed. And they asked what he was doing, and he said, "Well, I was talking with my Creator. I was in conversation with Baha'u'llah." Now, Muhammad Rizal was taken to prison. And when he was in prison, he would still teach everybody the faith. Right? He would just make an open and bold, courageous proclamation of the verities of the cause, who Baha'u'llah was. He couldn't meet anybody without telling them. Right? Really, that's what we're told to do. I think he was an emblem of glory. And at some point, the Baha'is became so nervous that he was so outspoken that they went to the jail master and they said, "Well, can you talk to this guy, and maybe if you go to him, he won't be quite so brazen in the way that he teaches." And the warden of the jail told him to not teach the faith quite so openly. And when he didn't listen, then they started to beat him within the prison. And there was a young man. His name was Ghulam Khan. Right? It doesn't matter what his name was, but imagine this man in prison. Young man, not a Baha'i. And he sees this man being whipped and beaten in prison. And he sees him doing it with great resignation, with happiness, with love for his Lord. And it impresses him so much that he investigates the verities of the cause and he becomes a Baha'i. Right? This is the way that Haydar Ali became a believer as well. Now he says that you could have recited to me hundreds of traditions, hundreds of verses from the Quran. You could have brought all kinds of convincing arguments. Right? But I saw the light of my Lord in flogging. They flogged the believer, and he met it with such spirit, such love, such resignation, and he continued to do what he was doing. And I found my Lord. Muhammad Rizal was a Baha'i. He was a Baha'i because he taught the cause the best way he knew at the time. right? If there was a house of justice at the time he was there and they told him to make home visits, he would have made them, right? At that time, the divine plan was to approach everybody you know, expecting to get beaten for it, and tell them about Baha'u'llah anyway. And he did that. That was the divine plan. Right? Most of us don't have to do that. Most of us might have to think that we won't be quite as cool as we were yesterday in front of some of our friends if we boldly proclaim who we are and why we live the way we do. Well, being a Baha'i is the coolest thing in the universe. You just have to tell your friends that. Now, Muhammad Rizal, right, he was in prison. And he did a couple things that I think are very special for us to reflect on whenever we can, right? You guys have read this story maybe from Abdul Baha or from Mr. Tahirzadeh. But when he was in prison, there was a Jewish man. And the Jewish man was foul, and he was utterly neglected by the Muslims. Thank you. He was utterly neglected by the Muslims that he was with. And he said to his companion, well, you and I, we should go and wash him and care for him, feed him. And his friend was a little bit grossed out, right? I mean, kind of like Louis Getzinger when Abdul Baha said, why don't you go and minister to that poor sick man, right, in the dirty house? And he said, well, you pour the water, and I'll scrub and sponge him clean. And they dressed him in fine raiment, and this Jewish man said, who are you? You can't be Jews. You can't be Muslims. You must be angels. You must be angels that God has sent. Well, friends, you are the angels, if you want to be, right? That's our faith. Christ will come in great glory with angels, and they're you, if you want to be, right? Or you can do whatever you want. Like you can, you know, I don't know what people do. You tell me, right? I mean, there's no destiny like this. Where are the emblems of that glory? Last story about Muhammad Rizal. A young man came into the prison and he was unclothed, right? He was half clothed. He had no shirt. And Muhammad Rizal said, well, this isn't right. You and I have a spare shirt, right? It's a luxury to have a spare shirt. Why don't we give it to him? And his friend, again, looking out for Muhammad Rizal, said that he was old, right? And they tried to care for him, bring him things, feed him. He was well respected, well learned, and a great servant of Baha'u'llah. He said, well, that's great. You give him your shirt, and I'll get the clean one for you. He said, how dare you? How dare you? Do you think that I should put my dirty shirt into the hands of the Blessed Beauty and take a clean one for myself? He said, aren't you a Baha'i? See, for Muhammad Rizal, it was impossible for a Baha'i to do anything better for oneself than he was willing to do for the people around him. Because to be alive in this contingent world was to serve the people around us. It was to embody the teachings of the faith. Right? That was it. Every day. You guys are well familiar with stories of Abdul Baha where he lived like this every day. Did he teach the faith? Did he proclaim the cause? With power, with fire, with wisdom? Absolutely. And did he give his pants away when he saw somebody walking by without any? Yes. Right? Why should I have two coats and somebody else doesn't have one? The Baha'is have to do it.
You know, I think these emblems exist today. It's not like we don't have wonderful, consecrated Baha'is. But certainly not enough. And certainly people, you know, this kind of engagement with our faith in Baha'u'llah, our recognition, our willingness to develop and deepen in what it is to truly recognize Baha'u'llah is scary, because a lot of times we find out that we don't necessarily believe in, as sincerely or as clearly as we want to. It's easier to say, I've accepted Baha'u'llah and that's the end, I'm a Baha'i. It's harder to say, wow, why don't I do what's called for? Right? If I'm supposed to open my lips and proclaim unceasingly his cause, and I'm not doing that, why not? Perhaps because I don't actually believe in Baha'u'llah, right? Or my faith is incomplete somehow. And it's that we're after, and that's why people have to go to the writings continually. It's that why they have to take seriously their independent investigation regardless of the family they were involved in. It's that where they have to tangle with the sons of the Lord of Hosts and tangle with, you know, the icon and find out whether a unity of religion really exists, whether Baha'u'llah is who he says he is. Right? Because he is, but it doesn't matter that I say he is for you. But when people find that, whenever they found that Baha'u'llah really has a salve for the whole world, then they're urgent about it. Right? Then it remakes their soul. The words of God remake their heart, actually create spirituality. And those people can't be held back from proclaiming the faith or from actually carrying out the divine plan. Those are the people that, you know, went out into the world in the 10-year crusade. Those are the letters of the living who scattered throughout the length and breadth of this land and with steadfast feet and sanctified hearts prepared the way for the coming of Baha'u'llah.
I think Abdu'l-Baha is interesting for us for obviously 14 million, more than that reasons. But one of them because one of the American believers came to Abdu'l-Baha on his visit here in 1912. And they asked him, well, how does one be a Baha'i? How does one live in accord with the Baha'i teachings? Right? Because, friends, if you'll entertain what I put forward for your consideration, and I say it with every ounce of love and respect that I can muster, right? You are Baha'is, and you're infinitely distinguished by Baha'u'llah. Right? You're the community of the greatest name. You're already at the height of heights. Right? It's just our own lack of awareness about it. So I don't tell you anything that you should do or as if I have some kind of knowledge and understanding that you lack. But I say that, you know, Abdu'l-Baha, they came to him and said, well, how do we be Baha'is? And I ask that we entertain the idea that even though we've signed our cards and have an ID badge or something from the faith and can get on, you know, a website, that we don't be too quick to judge ourselves Baha'is in light of the lives that have been led, the people who have died so that we could be Baha'is. And when they came to Abdu'l-Baha and asked him, how do we be Baha'is? He said, well, that the first requisite for being a Baha'i is to acquire a thirst for spirituality. We have precious little time together, but I ask you to take a few seconds and meditate on that. Do you have a thirst for spirituality? Are we thirsty? Think about what it's like to feel thirsty when you're hot. Right? Think about the end of the fast days that are approaching, when you haven't eaten all day, when you're thirsty, and how good it feels when you drink water. Is that how you feel about spirituality, about developing spirituality? Right? You know, I might ask, and I won't ask you to display this, but I ask you to consider alongside, you know, how many people feel like they are more spiritual beings, more complete spiritual beings, more sacrificial spiritual beings than they were 3 weeks ago? I don't know, right? I don't know what's in your hearts, and I'll never ever even consider, you know, suggesting what is. But I would suggest that the community of the greatest name at this moment is not rapidly advancing in their spiritual progress from week to week and day to day. And yet Baha'u'llah guarantees us that you cannot stay the same. You cannot hover in terms of your spiritual progress, right? Imagine having a baby, right? You know that everything in the spiritual worlds of God has a direct corresponding equivalent in the material world. Essentially everything does, right? This is why Abdu'l-Baha speaks so richly with metaphor from the natural world. Now you imagine having a baby, and imagine a year going by and your 2-year-old baby does not grow. How's the mother going to feel? Terrified. She's going to take it to every doctor and specialist that she can and say, my baby isn't growing. He hasn't grown, he hasn't put on weight. What if you're 6 years old, you have a 6-year-old child, and he hasn't progressed mentally from when he was 3, and he can't speak? How are you going to feel? Not good, right? Terrified. Well, what if 3 years pass in your life and a spiritual maturation that has been laid out for you that takes years and years of prayer and meditation, of service, of teaching? What happens if 3 years go by and you don't progress spiritually? See, there's a buffer in the world. You know, Becky said earlier, Counselor Murphy said that everything around us is reminding us of the material links to the world, right? Of our material condition. But our real being is spiritual. The material is the illusion. Right? Just like Baha'u'llah's revelation is reality itself. That's what is. Everything else is some kind of fragmentation or approximation of that reality. Friends, what I suggest is that it's impossible for us. We were created to mature. Right? God created mankind to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. And the purpose of religion, the purpose of the Baha'i cause, is so that we would grow, that our mystic communion with God would intensify and deepen. And if that's not happening, then we're falling back. Right? We're not doing what we're here for. I think that this thirst for spirituality is generated by a few things which Abdu'l-Baha offers to the friend. He says it's prayer. He says it's reading the writings, right? Because there's an associated spirit with the Word of God, like there's an associated spirit with each one of us, right? That spiritual nourishment is provided by the Word of God itself, that it opens the city of the human heart. And he says that it's by service and teaching. I'd like us to consider one other thing, and I'll draw upon the writings to do it. I also think it's based on conviction. Right? We have to actually believe that things are going to happen. A lot of us would like to teach the cause, right? I'm guessing. Okay? For those of you who are not Baha'is, when Baha'is talk about teaching the cause, we're talking about something very simple. If there is an elixir, if there is something quite beautiful that you know about, and the world has not yet awakened to that reality, well, then they need to get a chance to know. Right? Most people know that Christ died on the cross, supposedly. They know the basic events of his life. They don't know much about the life of Baha'u'llah and what he said. And it's up to the Baha'is to offer it to them. That's what we mean by teaching the cause. Abdu'l-Baha defined it as awakening souls. He said, you are the soul catchers, right? Awakening souls. Now, when we teach the cause, we might pray to teach. We need to ask ourselves whether we believe that Baha'u'llah is going to deliver. Right? When we pray for receptive souls, how do we act at the end of that prayer? If one prays to meet receptive souls, souls receptive to the faith of Baha'u'llah, then what? Right? You know the beginning of the long obligatory prayer? If you don't know this, you got to go look at it. It's the most beautiful thing there is in words. But the beginning of it says that one should turn his face to the right and to the left, as if awaiting the mercy of his Lord. Right? As he standeth in his place, let him gaze to the right and the left, as if awaiting the mercy of his Lord, the most merciful. Right? As if is an interesting thing. You have to actually be sort of an actor, or you have to raise this, that it's there. Right? You know what it's like to wait, like when you're a little kid and you're waiting for your parents to pick you up from some activity and they're late? And you're just waiting and you're watching the cars and they keep on coming by and you keep thinking that's going to be the car, and then it's not. Right? And then finally it's there, and it's there. And you see it and you kind of light up inside. Right? At least your wait is over. That's what you've got to look to the right and left and see the mercy of God coming to you as a reality. Right? Now, Abdu'l-Baha has instructed us as Baha'i teachers, right, to pray for receptive souls. And then we have to go out as if they're going to be available to us. Right? As if God is going to guide them to us. We have to act as though that's the reality. If you act as though maybe so, maybe God will do this, maybe he won't, well, it's possible that you've already kind of screwed up the formula. Anyway, you know that elsewhere in the writings, Shoghi Effendi has written that about the daily obligatory prayers. He says these daily obligatory prayers, along with the other few specific ones, such as the healing prayer, the tablet of Ahmad, have been invested by Baha'u'llah with a special potency and significance, and should be recited as such with unquestioning faith and confidence, that through them they may enter themselves into a much closer communion with him and identify themselves more fully with his laws and precepts. Right? You can look this up. I mangled it a little bit. The point being is that we have to recite those prayers with unquestioning faith and confidence. Where it doesn't work, that's kind of the recipe. Okay? I think we have to find it in our heart quite how to do that. But I just suggest for your consideration that in praying and wanting to teach and all these sort of things, we have to actually act like the covenant of Baha'u'llah is in operation, right? And it's for us. Where are the emblems of thy glory, O glory of the worlds? You know, the fire tablet is, I mentioned, it's an amazing piece of writing. And, you know, this passage that this comes out of is when Baha'u'llah is looking around and he says, the infidels have arisen in tyranny on every hand. Where is the compelling power of thine ordaining pen, O conqueror of the worlds? The barking of dogs is loud on every side. Where is the lion of the forest of thy might, O chastiser of the worlds? Coldness hath gripped all mankind. Where is the warmth of thy love, O fire of the worlds? Calamity hath reached its height. Where are the signs of thy succor, O salvation of the worlds? And abasement hath reached its lowest depth. Abasement hath reached its lowest depth. Where are the emblems of thy glory? You know, later, a few lines later in that prayer, Baha'u'llah is going to say, thou seest me forbidden to speak forth. Do you remember this? Thou seest me forbidden to speak forth. Then from where will spring thy melodies, O nightingale of the world? Then from where will spring thy melodies? Friends, I think we have to answer this question. Right, I mentioned before that there is a continuum in the history of the faith, that what applies then applies now, right? Everyone in this room, or many of you, and the ones who haven't read it yet should read it at lunch. It's called the Tablet of Ahmad, right? And we know that it's Ahmad, and we sit there and say, "O Ahmad, forget not my bounties while I'm absent." But it's talking to us, right? We all take it personally. Let's take everything in the faith personally, right? Where will spring thy melodies? Well, here, I hope, right? You know, when we get guidance from our supreme institution, the House of Justice, and you know how often it will be addressed to the Continental Board of Counselors, right? It might be addressed to the National Spiritual Assembly of the United States, right? It might be addressed to the Baha'is of the world. And it's pretty easy to lose yourselves amongst the Baha'is of the world. Oh, great. They probably mean the Baha'is in a different condition than I'm in right now because I'm really busy, right? But somebody else really ought to do that. Friends, in the same way that you take the Tablet of Ahmad personally, I ask you to take those letters just as personally, right? And this is in the spirit of Mr. Sears, right? Mr. Sears was so wonderful. And one of the things that he says is that when he gets this letter, right, to the Baha'is of the world or to the hands of the cause or whatever he does, he just crosses it out and he says, "Dear Bill, do this." Right? Mr. Forton would get the Rizvan message and he would wake up every day and he would read it. Right? The next day, Tuesday, he would read it. Wednesday, he would read it. Thursday, he'd read the Rizvan message. Right? 3 months later, Friday, reading the Rizvan message. Because that was his marching order. Friends, is it our marching order? When was the last time we read the Rizvan message and said, is this working in our neighborhood? Right? That's what we have to do. And I'm saying there's plenty of people, you know, doing plenty of things. Nobody's going to know what they were. 50 years, 100 years? What everybody's up to, I can't even think of what it is, right? I mean, people love the Patriots and they love the Red Sox and, you know, they love to dance and, you know, all these things are great, right? Baha'u'llah wants everything for you. He says, I give you everything, right? O son of dust, everything in the creation I've created for you except your heart. I want that, right? You take what you want. You spend time doing what you want, but your heart is mine. Sanctify it for my descent. Right? This is the seat of the revelation of the inner mysteries of God. Why live a life that's so low stakes? Why live a life that's sure to be forgotten about? There was a tablet addressed to the handmaidens, specifically to women at one point. And it refers them to the queens that have walked on the earth. It says, take a look at the queens that have walked the earth. Who are they? Where are they? Where are their kingdoms? What matters is raising up souls, empowering souls to know about the virtue and dignity, the wonder that is within them. Right? Most of you know this phrase from Ali. It gets appropriated and made the word of God over again, in a sense, by Baha'u'llah in the Seven Valleys. He says, dost thou reckon thyself only a puny form, when within thee the universe is folded? Dost thou reckon thyself only a puny form? You think there aren't emblems of glory in here? Abdul-Baha would have come to this room, and like he did in his ziyarat, he would have said, make me as dust in the pathway of thy loved ones, and grant that I may offer up my soul for the earth ennobled by the footsteps of thy chosen ones in thy path. O Lord of glory in the highest. That's what Abdul-Baha thought about each one of you. He said, get rid of me, just make me dust in the pathway of these people. Because they're so noble, they're so distinguished for bearing the greatest name. Do we deserve to be dust in Abdul-Baha's path? I mean, does he deserve? Do we deserve that he would be dust in our pathway? Right? We'll get that eventually.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to a new Baha'i today, and she was expressing how when she first came into the faith, she had never felt so close to God. And yet within just a very few months, she had never felt so far away. And it's a real challenge to become a Baha'i. It's a hard thing to do. You know, it should be so easy. I mean, it makes sense. Right. The teachings apply. There's never been so many proofs associated with any manifestation of God. There's never been such an abundance of beautiful and moving and applicable writings. But when Baha'u'llah reaches and takes somebody's heart and takes them up to the summit of summits and lets them see and look around, we think that we've achieved, you know, something, we've attained something. And yet Baha'u'llah speaks very differently to people's state and their station. Right? When we go through the Seven Valleys and you have these places of search and love and knowledge and wonderment and unity, right? You know, he says that on one hand there's the state that God, it's like a gift from God. You get to glimpse these beauties in yourselves or in each other or in the world. But then you're back down, and it's just a cause of your aspiration, right? That you know it exists, and so you strive after it. But we have to labor in a kind of ongoing maturation process to change our station, right? Just the way that a young child needs, you know, can't be leaned upon to do calculus or to solve complex global problems or, you know, to perform delicate surgeries. I mean, it's going to take a lot of years of training and maturation to do any of those things. So with spirituality, right? I mean, why would it take years and years to perfect playing concertos or something, and yet to, you know, be a spiritually realized human being, we want to be there because we had a glimpse of it once. You know, for me, I came around the Baha'is when I was in high school, and you know, I was really lucky because I was in Los Angeles and there was an active workshop and some really special families associated with it, one in particular. And I went one day to this workshop with a friend of mine who was actually kind of loosely affiliated with the faith. And he you know, brought me around some people that I thought were really special and really consecrated, and at the end of the day they sat down and said prayers, you know, with nobody really leading and no adult kind of supervision or force, and I found that very moving. And somehow I came away with the hidden words and went home and read some of those passages, and you know, I can still remember, this is that which hath descended from the realm of glory, uttered by the tongue of power and might, and revealed unto the prophet's fold. We have taken the inner essence thereof and clothed it in the garment of brevity, as a token of grace unto the righteous. And you know, that voice, and that voice that started to speak through the early utterances in the Arabic hidden words, you know, the best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. Right? Turn not away therefrom if thou desirest me. You know, veiled in my immemorial being and in the ancient eternity of my essence, I knew my love for thee. Right? I mean, whatever it was, I didn't even know who Baha'u'llah was. But I knew that those utterances spoke to the reality of my soul. Like that was kind of an easy, seamless transition. Like whatever that authority was live and was real and was new parts of me that I had kind of ceased to admit existed. Like was more hopeful about my spiritual state or the soul that I had than I was about it. Like I'd learned to shut myself off to divine realities in myself that it spoke to, and I guess I guessed were there, but had learned to forget about. And so it was really easy to understand through the Word of God that whatever this source was true. And yet it still took some time where I'd really gauged who Baha'u'llah was and about organized religion or whatever. But, that said, when I became a Baha'i, like this woman, I was super close, and I just tore through writings and wept and, was so optimistic about the state of the world and about if people could get these teachings, how quickly they would come into the cause and all of these sorts of things. And also so impressed, so deeply impressed by some of the Baha'is that I knew, that when I came into a wider cross-section of the community or found out about the concept of inactive believers or something like this, I was so shocked. And so let down. And then you realize that there's so many gifts that Baha'u'llah gives us, like changing our hal, right? Changing our state, where we get to see what wonderment is, and we're walking around going, oh God, increase my astonishment at thee, right? Like Baha'u'llah says in the Seven Valleys. And then the next day we can't muster up the strength to say our obligatory prayer, right? And then you're wondering how the heck that happened, right? And maybe I'm not really worthy anyway, and maybe God isn't speaking to me, and I kind of made a mistake, or he made a mistake in the evaluation process. Whatever the factor. And you realize that God gives you these uplifting kind of moments. And then you've got to take the training wheels off. And what happens when you take the training wheels off is you crash. Right? I mean, and you're used to the wind in your hair, and you were kind of breezing along and seeing all the scenery. And then Baha'u'llah said, okay, now take a couple of steps, without quite that much grace, at least in this respect, or take a next step up that's going to be a little bit uncomfortable. And I think over and over again, early on, then I fell, right? Because I wanted more out of the Baha'is. I wanted Baha'u'llah's Baha'is, the ones he talked about, right? The ones that I would have ceaseless admiration for. And I do, I think that ultimately we have to recognize about ourselves and about one another that Abdu'l-Baha was somebody who said, make me as dust in the pathway of thy loved ones, and grant that I may offer up my soul for the earth ennobled by the footsteps of thy chosen ones in thy path. Baha'u'llah said, I long, in the Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, he says, I long to lay my face upon every spot of the earth. Right? That haply it might touch the ground, I'm paraphrasing his words, upon which one of thy lovers have trodden, right? Like he loved us so much, thought so much of our station for being Baha'is, for bearing the name of Baha'is. Because he saw the divinity in us, right? Abdu'l-Baha certainly saw the divinity in us. Saw us as so distinguished to be chosen out by Baha'u'llah himself for this revelation that he wanted to lay himself down in our path. And it's that we've got to get better at seeing. Because we are imperfect, right? And Abdu'l-Baha says, love people for the sake of God, not for themselves. If you love them for them, or try to, they'll always disappoint you. Right? He says true love doesn't even exist between people. It's always some kind of channel through God where enduring love is. And I think as we try to move closer to this in marriages, in our relationships within the faith, try to see the ends for people and outside the faith. Right? You can't teach the faith if you don't believe that these people were created by God, created to know and worship God, and that there's unmined, infinite spiritual potential in every one of them. Right? Like you've got to see the end in the beginning. Abdu'l-Baha says that a wise man looks at the seed and he sees the tree. Right? And if we're teaching the faith or trying to embody the divine teachings to people, in act and deed and the teaching campaigns that we're doing through the core activities, I mean, the people that we're doing them with, even the tutees or the people, collaborators in our own study circles, we've got to see those people in our study circles as people who are going to go out and set aflame the world. Right? People who are going to establish study circles and children's classes with all kinds of people and spread a lot of joy and optimism and understanding and reflection. They're going to facilitate the facilitate a transformative spiritual process for a cross-section of humanity. Right? If we can't do that, if we're not optimistic about those people and their potential, then we're wasting our time. It's the same way. You can't teach the faith where you don't believe that good things are going to happen. You can't pray for receptive souls and then assume that Baha'u'llah's probably not going to send them anyway. You have to pray for receptive souls and then go into the world expecting to meet them, sure that you're going to meet them. And that's the covenant, right? And when we believe, then it tends to happen. You know, I think that as far as anyway, you were asking about the Baha'is disappointing people, and Rain mentioned, you know, being disappointed by the Baha'is, and I think that, you know, we've got to recognize that it's up to us to play what role we can in the building of a civilization. And some of the excitement is that it isn't made, right? That God didn't do it for us, that we have a role to play, each one of us. But some of it is that we need to see with new eyes who people really are. And when we see them, right, when we see the divinity in them and love them for that, then they'll be better, because we see betterness in them. I mean, husbands and wives, one of the great things about marriage is that a husband or a wife has the potential to see beauty and perfection in somebody that doesn't see it in themselves. Right? Like, you feel weak and you feel like this part of you is embarrassing and, you know, you're insecure and this sort of thing, and this person sees something beautiful there. And then you're able to start seeing it in yourselves. And that's what Abdu'l-Baha did for people. Right? Or that's what Christ did when he said, "What beautiful teeth," in that dead dog. Right? And when we start to be better at that inside the Baha'i community, then we'll make the kind of revelation or the kind of faith that Baha'u'llah, you know, already laid the groundwork for, certainly.
Well, friends, we were created to live that kind of life. And everything else, we're just spending time. We're just busy, like everybody else. You know how disgusting that is? Forgive me for saying this, but do you know how disgusting it is when people say, "What are you doing? How are you?" "Oh, I'm busy." Right? I mean, sure, you're busy. You got educations to get, and you got work to do. Right? You got all sorts of things. But you've got the greatest mission ever entrusted to humanity before you. The greatest thing that anybody ever had to do, to be the awakeners of souls. Right? The reason that I start to talk to you about teaching, and we have a little less than 10 minutes, and I'm going to talk more specifically maybe about the plan, if I can. But you know, Abdu'l-Baha, in address to the friends in the West, said that all the talks, all the deliberations had to revolve around one focal center. And that is this: teach the cause. Teach. Teach. Convey the message, awaken the souls. Nothing else will be useful today. That's what Abdu'l-Baha says. You do what you want, but nothing else will be useful today. And he says, while we are carrying this load, we can carry no other load. Now, friends, if we are to rise and be the Muhammad Rizals of our day, right, if we're to actually look at Abdu'l-Baha not as a hero, but as an exemplar, right, that's a hard transition sometimes to make, but that's what we're told to do. Then we have to look at, you know, are we crossing out the names at the beginning of a letter like that of September 30th and putting our name there? Dear Brett, here's what you got to do. Right? You know that there's these calls, and this is such a beautiful gift to us in the West, in these different clusters. I don't know whether you're from, clusters. If you're not a Baha'i, there are communities of Baha'is everywhere you know. Everywhere you go, you find somebody. Sometimes it's just one somebody, being the Baha'i, wherever they are. Sometimes there's 9, sometimes there's 30, sometimes there's 3,000, right? They're largely small communities all over the world at once. And essentially, the House of Justice, the supreme institution, has organized some of these communities in maybe the greatest political act in history. They've essentially said that the face of the planet is equal. We're going to carve it up into what we call clusters, groups of communities, right? The whole planet, like it was one nation. Now, in these different clusters, the Baha'is can come together and kind of pool their resources and help each other to take steps forward. And for a while, we thought as Baha'is that we had to have a certain amount of Baha'is or so many different resources in these clusters. And in this recent letter of September 30th, thank you, the House of Justice says, well, don't worry about how many resources you can get together necessarily. Or from the International Teaching Center, the letter is actually from, the right arm of the House of Justice. They said, don't worry about how many Baha'is you get together. Get a few people together. Get you and like 2 or 3 of your friends. And then actually get together and pray for receptivity and go out and directly present in small groups the fundamental verities of the faith. Go into the world Pray at home by all means, right? Have devotional gatherings. Study the Word of God together, right? Be Baha'is. But don't forget that you were created to bear the name of God, right? You're the bearers of the name of God in this day. So make sure that you get together and pray and consecrate yourselves and then go out into the world and do it. Friends, if you're spending 8 hours a month thinking about the Baha'i faith, or 80 hours a month thinking about it, and half of that time is not spent going out into the world to actually meet people that are not yet acquainted with the revelation of Baha'u'llah, and acquainting them and loving them and helping them study it and meeting them where they are, well, then what are we doing? We're wasting our time. We're just hanging out together. It's not why Baha'u'llah gave us the revelation. You're so gifted. You're so special. We're all so special. You know, I mean, everybody's special, and I'm not creating a love-in, but I'm saying do you have any idea how special you are to know that something that can elevate the condition of every soul in the universe is yours? It's a great trust, but you have to do something with it. Abdu'l-Baha said, "Soon will your swiftly passing days be over, and the fame and riches, the comforts, the joys provided by this rubbish heap, the world, will be gone without a trace. Summon ye then the people to God, and invite humanity to follow the example of the company on high." That's what's to do. That's all that's to do. And, you know, have a good time too. I mean, celebrate your birthday, do everything that you like to do. Right? Play music. I mean, we should, but do it in the spirit of the faith. We've got precious, precious little time. You know that moment in the Seven Valleys when Baha'u'llah says, not every branch will flower. Right? Nor will the nightingale sit thereon. Then ere I don't remember, the bird repair to the garden of God. Right? Make thou an effort. He says, make an effort while you have a chance. You have such precious little time to do it. Baha'u'llah in the Aqdas says something that speaks to this and to all of us. He's talking about the cause of God. And, you know, I'll leave you with just a couple of thoughts on this. I think we have 3 minutes. You know, sometimes as Baha'is, it's possible that we have this idea that we're like a club. We're sort of a weird social club. We're kind of a congregation. It's kind of cool. It's kind of strange. Right? We like to hang out together. We like to come here to the hotel because everybody's Baha'is and everybody's going to love us, and that's really great. Right? But it's kind of weird too, and kind of awkward, and you know, what we do tomorrow about it when we're back with our friends is something else. Well, the Guardian says this is not acceptable. The Guardian says the Baha'is must have one life. One life. Right? They can't be Baha'is over here and then something else over here. Right? That's just being true. In a world plagued by falsity, right? Where lying has pretty much become the national pastime in America. I mean, look at our politicians, look at everybody, you know, that you see, it's just acceptable. Oh, I said this racist remark, oh, I didn't really mean it, I'm so sorry. Well, nonsense, right? But we know you're supposed to say that now. Well, the Baha'is aren't supposed to say anything, they're supposed to be Baha'is. Everywhere, all the time. Now, Baha'u'llah speaks pointedly to this, I think, in the Aqdas. He says, think not that this is a cause which may be made a plaything for your idle fancies, nor is it a field for the foolish nor the faint of heart. Right? Not a plaything. Not a field for the foolish nor the faint of heart. By God, this is the arena of insight and detachment, of vision and upliftment, where none may spur on their chargers save the valiant horsemen of the merciful. These verily are they that render God victorious on earth. Wow. That's pretty hot stuff. I mean, but it asks a lot. Right? It asks everything. Now, elsewhere in the Aqdas, and this is, I'm going to leave you on a very scary note, right? I think we're almost out of time. If this wasn't scary enough, right? American History X to don't think it's a plaything, but it's not a plaything. You have to do something. You have to do something every day. to grow in the faith. You don't have to go from 0 to 100, but you have to mature. Right? Think about the things you can do as young adults and adults today that you couldn't do 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Some of you play piano, right? Kelsey plays beautiful guitar. You think she just one day decided she would play beautiful music? No way. She worked at it and labored at it. She refined her skill. And that's the whole point of this world, is cycles and maturation. And we have to mature and grow in the faith. And if we don't, wow, is it going to be scary in the next world. Not because Baha'u'llah is going to love us any less, it's just we're going to have squandered our lives. At any rate, Baha'u'llah says something very pointed in the Aqdas. He says, be careful lest ye deal faithlessly with God. I'm paraphrasing his words here. He says, because he who deals faithlessly with God, him God may deal faithlessly with. Right? If you meet God with faithlessness, that's what you might be met with. Now, I suggest for our consideration, friends, that we have to reevaluate how proud we are about the faith, how open we are about the faith, how truthful we are in the way that we convey the faith, and how truthful we are at localizing the guidance from our supreme institution and from the International Teaching Center in our own lives and neighborhoods. Abdu'l-Baha says very clearly that if we don't engage fully in the teaching work, fully in the divine plan, the divine assistance is essentially cut off. That doesn't mean you can just find a way to serve in the community that doesn't really involve you having a role to play in carrying forward the teachings. There's a place for everybody in the faith of God. Everybody. That was the 1 minute, okay. 1 minute mark? 0 minutes? Ah, I like that. Okay. So friends, there's a place for everybody in the faith to propagate the cause of God. Right? To do something with the virtues with which you've been invested. I'll leave you with the words of the Bab, right? Councillor Murphy spoke about this address earlier, and I just want to refer you to one thing about it because it speaks to the divinity in you, right? Baha'u'llah says, turn thy sight unto thyself. I'm there. Heaven and hell are there, right? I'm within you. And the Bab says, beseech the Lord your God. Beseech him to grant that no earthly entanglements, no worldly affections, no ephemeral pursuits may tarnish the purity or embitter the sweetness of that grace which flows through you. Right? Wow, what a trust, what a life you can live. The grace of God which flows through you, to have the greatest destiny of anybody ever. Shoghi Effendi says that Peter and the apostles that I spoke about earlier are as nothing compared to the deeds that you're capable of. Right? That the prophets of the Old Testament long to live in this day, to have what you have. Oh, don't do nothing about it when you get home. Read the September 30th letter, please, friends. I wish I would have spoke about it more. Find a way to apply it to your life. Find 3 or 4 friends and do something about it to take the message directly to the people around you. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.